Hello, Jacksonites, and welcome to part three of my read through of the original Return of the Living Dead novel. Let's just not beat around the bush. Last time we left off, shit was hitting the fan. The dead were returning to life and they're starting their rampage. The pregnant gal, her dad was killed in the last part by a group of zombies, and now a group of kind of sketchy looking police officers have rescued them from the zombies and now boarding up their house, but there's one or two that are already looking a little suspicious. And the sheriff of the town is now starting to realize that the dead are indeed returning to life. And we got a couple nice references to Night of the Living Dead, but also one glaring continuity error. But with all that being said, first off, blue raspberry saltwater taffy. That shit's good. I need to keep this away from me. And to crack it open our sponsor. And let us jump into Return of the Living Dead. Chapter 12. Flack looked at Wade Connolly. Wade, before we get too comfortable. What? Before we get too comfortable, you and I have got work to do. Wade stood up and grinned. The bound and gagged men on the floor followed Wade and Flack with their eyes. It's going to be dark for a long time now, Flack said. We might need a bonfire to cheer things up. There's plenty of dead, dry skin outside. It ought to be put to some use. Angel jerked her head towards Flack and stared at the man as though she didn't know whether to laugh or shudder. Wade grinned, then chuckled as he and Flack picked up their rifles and went outside into the yard. The area was bathed in the stark illumination furnished by bright lights on both the front and side porches. Keeping their rifles ready, Flack and Wade Connolly stepped to the back of their pickup truck, and Wade covered him while Flack struck matches and got a kerosene lantern going. Yeah, my camera caught that.
That's funny.
Kids. He placed the lantern atop the cab of the truck where it would increase the light spilling out over the front lawn. At the edge of the lighted area, several humanoid forms backed off and stood still, trying to conceal themselves in shadow as if they were frightened by the presence of men with fire, something being carried over from the original Night of the Living Dead with the zombies being afraid of fire. The humanoids moved with their characteristic painful slowness and did not really succeed in concealing themselves, but merely moved from the bright light into light which was murkier and must have seemed like total darkness to their dim eyesight. Flack and Wade Connolly scanned the perimeter of the lit area and also peered deep into the darkness beyond. By comparing observations, they were sure they had spotted at least 11 humanoids trying to keep hidden in the overhang of trees and shrubs. A half dozen more were apparent in the shadowy light at the edges of the lawn. We better light some torches, Flack said. We can use our revolvers and keep the rifles leaning against the side of the porch in case we need to get to them in a hurry. That's a terrible idea. Just shoulder them. The two men moved to the back of the truck, and again Wade Connolly covered Flack while he wrapped and tied cloth strips around the ends of what looked like old table legs. Flack soaked the rags in kerosene from a 5-gallon can, struck a match, and lit the makeshift torches one by one. That'll keep the dead bastards away, Wade said. And each with torch in hand, he and Flack stepped away from the back of the truck, leaned their rifles against the porch railing, drew their revolvers, and surveyed the once human debris in the front yard. The area was littered with the bodies of vanquished ghouls, while others not yet conquered had gathered enough courage to move out of the partial darkness and now stood, bathed in stark light and hard shadows, looking on. An eerie hissing sound came from the edges of the lawn, and from the deeper darkness, a sick sound emanating from the dead things that made their presence more ominous. The sound was the painful rasping breaths of dead lungs, a chorus of death rattles that sent chills up the spines of the two men carrying the torches. Hell no. I'd be shooting them. Why the hell are you just letting them stand there? They observed several of the creatures step forward out of the semi-darkness, and it made them uneasy. Bastards don't stay frightened long, Wade Connolly said, whispering as though not to call the thing's attention to himself. Get the meat hooks, Flack said, his voice as tight and strained as Wade's. Before moving, Wade shot a glance at Flack because it was so unlike Flack to let anyone see he was rattled. It made Wade feel better to know tough old Flack was as nervous as he was. Flack stared with horrified fascination into the faces of the dead things. Their complexions, so bloodless and white, emphasized the black, swollen bruises they must have sustained prior to death. He wondered if the black, caked, dried blood was from their own wounds or from wounds of recent victims of their quest for human flesh. One of the creatures took a step forward, and Flack gritted his teeth. A loud report belched forth when Flack squeezed his trigger, and the dead thing was flung backwards by the force of the bullet, exploding inside its brain, blasting out the back of its skull, crumpling the thing onto the grass in a stinking heap of soiled clothing and rotting flesh and dead bones. Descriptive, appetizing. The rest of the creatures did not back off. They seemed uninterested in the death of one of their own kind. They did not attack and cannibalize the newly fallen one. They craved instead freshly slaughtered human flesh, warm and bleeding, still with the taste of life. Warm human flesh was the only kind that could nourish the living dead. Wade Connolly stood up, startled when Flack's gun went off. He watched the shot humanoid reel and tumble to the earth and shuddered when its companions exhibited no reaction, no wariness or fear of a similar fate. You could not frighten these things off by killing them. The only thing they seemed to fear instinctively was fire, their dry, dead skin being exceedingly flammable. Give me a meat hook. Hurry up! Flack shouted, the bark of his voice setting Wade moving again, rummaging in the back of the truck. Wade pulled out 2 pairs of gloves, tossed one pair over to Flack, and put the other pair on. With every move the two men made, they had to juggle their torches and revolvers from one hand to the other. Stick the torches in the ground. Only one meat hook, Flack said. I'll do the work, you keep me covered, figuring to rely on his flaming torch for protection. Flack holstered his revolver and took the meat hook. Wade handed him. Wade Connolly covered while Flack moved over to the body of one of the vanquished humanoids and, swinging the meat hook hard, thrust it into the soft abdominal flesh of the solar plexus, where the bones of the rib cage would furnish a solid anchor for the hook so it could be used to drag the dead body over the ground. One by one, Flack moved each corpse in this way, dragging them to a chosen spot in the center of the lawn and piling them like firewood. Working fast and hard because of the undercurrent of fear the task inspired in him, Flack finished the grisly job of piling nearly a dozen dead bodies in a surprisingly short time. The stench of the rotting flesh was overpowering, making the two men breathe in short gasps when they could no longer hold their breaths. Flack was exhausted. He needed more air than this method of breathing provided, and he finally forced himself to breathe normally, fighting against gagging and the urge to vomit. When the corpses were stacked in a pile, Flack poured kerosene over them, sloshing the fluid out of the can in great quantities, splashing it sloppily in his hurry to get finished. Wade Connolly watched, his finger tightening on the trigger when he considered shooting a few more of the things for the peace of mind he thought it might get from blasting a few more. Save your ammunition, Flack said, noticing Wade's anxiety. You shot one, Wade replied. Flack capped the can of kerosene. The ghouls were doused, ready to be burned. The two men did not intend to immediately ignite the dead bodies, but wanted to do it later should it become necessary to make a break from the house to the vehicles. Hopefully, the bonfire of dead flesh would cause any attacking humanoids to back away. With a backup of supporting gunfire and handheld torches, an escape path could be cleared. Smart. The two men took off their gloves and tossed them into the back of the truck along with the meat hook. They backed into the house carrying their rifles and torches. Wade made another trip outside for the lantern and the can of kerosene. When he entered the living room again, he barred the door and bolted it. Chapter 13. Angel was dozing on the couch. John Carter was sitting in the easy chair by the cold fireplace, his eyes straying now and then to the trussed up prisoners lying flat on their backs in the center of the floor. Beside Carter, an empty teacup rested on the arm of the chair. Flack and Wade went into the kitchen to wash their hands, found cups on the kitchen table and a steaming pot of tea on the stove. I want more than tea, for Christ's sake, Flack said. I'm hungry, and opened the refrigerator to look for something to eat. Upstairs, Billy and Ann got Sue Ellen into bed and were watching over her, hoping she would again regain consciousness. Karen walked slowly up the top of the stairs, having left the kitchen upon hearing Wade and Flack enter the living room. She averted her eyes and held back tears when she passed her father's bedroom on her way down the hall. The door to that bedroom was half closed, a pale beam of light from the hall throwing murky shadows into the room. Most of the room hid in darkness. Deep in the room, seeking the blackest spot, a hulking humanoid form stood silent. This dead being had feasted on Burt Miller's flesh. Its bestial craving temporarily sated, it was content to remain motionless, biding its time, for now unmotivated and devoid of purpose. It didn't do a very good job clearing out the house. Karen entered the room where Sue Ellen was, half expecting to see her sister awake and doing better. Anne and Billy looked up, their faces conveying the message that there had been no change in her condition. I'll watch her, Karen said. You two can go downstairs and get some tea if you want to. As Billy and Anne started down the stairs, they heard a wild squeal of laughter from the living room. Flack, stuffing a sandwich into his mouth, rushed past the landing, followed by Wade Connolly, as Anne and Billy reached the bottom of the steps and entered the living room. Angel was laughing, kneeling before something in the far corner of the room. Wade and Flack were hovering over her, and Flack's giggle joined Angel's excited cries. The two bound and gagged men strained to look in the direction of Angel's laughter. They saw that she had moved a set of bookshelves and discovered an old floor safe with a combination lock. Bet I can guess the combination, Angel said, wetting her lips with a flick of her tongue. I had an aunt who was psychic. Maybe the real vultures got us after all. Everybody looked in Billy's direction, stunned, just staring at him. That was an ungrateful thing to say. That's a narcissistic thing to say. Angel said, her eyes flashing. Flack and Wade turned and took a few menacing steps forward, Flack drawing a knife from a sheath on his belt. Suddenly, Flack swung the knife toward Wade, handle first, the handle thrust toward Wade's lips as though it were a microphone. Wade laughed, understanding the charade to come. Angel grinned and laughed. John Carter remained silent in his chair, watching everything. Anne and Billy, beginning to get frightened, felt cold beads of sweat run down their faces. Holding the microphone towards Wade, microphone, quote unquote, Flack said, I understand that just a couple hours ago, state troopers rescued a few country bumpkins during an attack of ghoul like creatures. That's the way I got the story, Wade replied, looking serious and obviously enjoying his part. The troopers came out of nowhere and rescued the country folk in the nick of time. I'd say that the troopers were really troopers about the whole thing. He grinned broadly at his own wit. Indeed they were, Fleck said. And what does it feel like, Trooper Connolly, to be a hero and to have saved the lives of total strangers? To have risked your neck for persons you didn't even know? It feels good at first, but what? People have short memories, Wade said slowly, looking directly at Anne and Billy. Now you wait just a minute, Billy blurted, but Flack cut him short, pushing him backward onto the couch. Flack leaned over the boy, holding him down with the knee on his chest. He put the knife inches from Billy's throat. You wait a minute, pal, Flack retorted, spitting the words through clenched teeth. What did you do to Sue Ellen? Anne blurted. She was so frightened the words rushed out before she could stop them, her fear giving voice to something which before had only been a subconscious suspicion. Flack looked astonished, wounded and stunned. He left the boy on the couch, facing Anne with a hurt look in his eyes. Billy lay on the couch, rubbing his throat and chest, his flushed face contorted with anger, fear, and pain. In a serious, sincere tone, Flack said, You see those two prisoners over there? Take a good look at them. Child molesters. And we have to risk our necks to keep their filthy flesh alive just to bring them to trial. Flack paused and grinned. We didn't really have to stop and save your lives, but we did. Sorry. And since we'll be holed up here for a while, we're going to need some cooperation. Now, I think it's time we had a little something to eat, a little home cooked meal. We don't know how bad it's going to get out there. Now, which one of you is the cook? Anne and Billy looked at each other. Billy, his face still red, was sitting upright on the couch. All right, I'll do it, Anne said in a barely audible voice. She made a move toward the kitchen, but stopped when she heard the sound of the TV. John Carter had flicked on the set and stood over it, waiting for the tube to warm up. Carter's eyes were fastened on the TV screen, not that he was particularly interested in the picture slowly forming. He was simply uninterested in anything else at the moment. He possessed an aura of quiet authority. Although he had not said much, his presence was always a factor in the room. He seemed to speak only when he disapproved of something or wanted a thing done a certain way. He was willing to let things happen until they needed to be stopped. Carter was clearly the boss without needing to constantly remind everyone of it. A news program drew everybody's attention. An announcer was speaking from behind a desk in the television studio. Apparently, the phenomena is not confined to the two state area as was first believed. Reports have been coming in from all over. A night nurse in a New York hospital tells of her bizarre experience. The people in the living room of the Miller farmhouse moved closer to the TV as the image dissolved from the announcer to a news film of a young woman being interviewed. Karen, drawn downstairs by the sound of the broadcast, moved quietly to a place next to Anne. Uh oh. The prisoners on the floor raised their heads to try and see the screen, peering between the legs standing in front of the set. On screen, the nurse spoke into a microphone handheld by a reporter on the scene at the New York hospital. Well, she began to explain, still very shaken from the experience, I had just wheeled a dead organ donor from the operating room downstairs into the anteroom. The heart had been removed. I wheeled him into place, turned away for a moment, and when I turned back again, he was walking toward me. I still can't believe it. I ran out of the room, called for help, and when we looked inside, he had broken through a window. In a second, he was gone. The broadcast returned to the anchorman in the studio. I repeat, terrible reports of this kind are coming in from all across the nation. Uh oh. Karen suddenly moaned loudly, backed against a chair, and fell into it. Okay, Karen's the pregnant one. Doubled over in pain. Billy and Anne rushed to her and tried to help her walk to the couch. She moved slowly, very stiffly, frightened at the possibility that her labor pains had begun. It's supposed to be a month away, Karen cried, her arms folded over her body as Anne and Billy eased her down onto the couch. This can't be happening now. How bad is it? Anne asked. That pain before hurt real bad, and it feels like it's going to start again. While Billy and Anne tried to comfort Karen, the TV broadcast continued, watched attentively by Flack and Angel, John Carter, and Wade Connolly. The face of the announcer filled the screen. The recently dead, people from morgues, funeral homes, and hospitals are coming back to life and feasting on human flesh. No one knows how many people have been killed by the ghouls only to rise themselves to join the ranks of the walking dead. Obviously, if this plague is not checked, it could lead to the destruction of the human race. In most areas, local police, National Guard units, and volunteers have begun working around the clock in order to control the problem. Needless to say, this is turning both our cities and rural areas into bloody battlefields. And the disaster has been worsened by the fact that people are turning against each other. Bands of looters and rapists are wandering the countryside, especially in remote rural areas, taking advantage of the breakdown of law and order that has come in the wake of the invasion of the ghouls. Reports of murder, rape, and arson have been commonplace. Here in our own county, Sheriff Conan McClellan, who dealt efficiently with a similar emergency 10 years ago, has once again taken command of an armed posse of policemen and civilian volunteers. We interviewed Sheriff McClellan earlier today, but I feel like this is foreshadowing. The TV broadcast cut to newsreel footage of the McClellan interview. McClellan and a reporter stood in the foreground, while in the background there was a bustle of activity. A bivouac area could be seen behind the two men. Tents were going up with men with dogs, guns, and campfires. Jeeps and emergency vehicles were everywhere. The sheriff had on civilian clothes. The trousers of his dark suit were tucked into scuffed hiking boots, and his tie was loosened. He looked very tired. He carried a high powered rifle with a scope and a belt of ammunition over his shoulder. Sheriff, how does this present emergency compare with what happened 10 years ago? Asked the reporter, holding up a mic. The sheriff answered decisively, this is worse, much worse. The people have turned against each other. We can control the ghouls, I think, but we have the looters and rapists to contend with. Do you have any explanation for what's happening? None whatsoever. I just do my job. I never thought this damn business would happen all over again. Sheriff, what makes you think you can defeat the ghouls? We did once before. We can defeat and destroy these things. Cleaning up afterward, that's the difficult. John Carter stood and switched off the set. He turned and faced Anne and Billy, who had been listening to Karen's regular moaning. They were quietly asking her about the intensity of her pains, trying to keep her calm, and talking about the likelihood of the baby's premature birth. It hurts so bad, Karen wailed after a particularly bad spasm of pain, and the pains are coming again and again. We'll have to get her to a hospital, Billy said, darting his eyes towards John Carver for approval. Carter, excuse me. Carter shook his head from side to side. It's too dangerous to go outside. Flack smirked, jerked a cigarette out of a pack, and lit it. Let's get Karen upstairs for now, Anne said resignedly to Billy. Billy and Anne helped Karen from the couch and started for the stairs. Flack stepped in front of them and stopped them. Seized with another contraction, Karen bent over, moaning, clutching her abdomen. Where do you think you're going? Flack demanded. Anne tried to help Karen while Billy stared bewilderedly into the man's face. Karen stopped moaning and also looked at him curiously. Anne looked over at John Carter, a pleading look in her eyes. Just ask my permission, Flack said. Angel nudged Wade in the ribs, amused by the whole thing. Wade Connolly grinned. Flack made his whips into an oval and blew a chorus of smoke rings. Please, Anne breathed, looking at Carter. She could not understand why he allowed one of his men to act like this, considering the situation. Please what? Flack insisted, prodding, enjoying the authority. What an asshole. Oh, Horror and Metal is here. Yo, the Horror and Metal channel. Tears came to Anne's eyes. Please let us take her upstairs, she whispered, looking at Flack helplessly. That's better, Flack said. All right, go ahead. Billy and Anne hurried up the stairs with Karen, who had broken into a sweat. Come on, you guys, Angel said. Let's get this safe open. Flack faced Carter and spoke angrily. Let's get off this merry-go-round. Let's figure what we're going to do with these people and do it. Relax, Carter said. The games are just beginning. Wade Connolly chuckled and winked at Angel, who was kneeling on the floor and spinning the combination of the safe, her ear to the mechanism. Screw the games, Flack said. We're wasting time here. If we don't crack the Kingsley place, somebody else will. At the mention of the Kingsley place, the two men on the floor eyed each other. Damn it, you guys, Angel yelled. Shut up and help me with this safe. Maybe they're not state troopers after all. Wade Connolly moved a few paces and stood looking down at Angel. Sandpaper your fingers, he said jokingly. I'll crack this son of a bitch, Angel said. I can feel the clicks. I don't trust them upstairs, Flack said to John Carter. Carter glanced toward the stairs, then to Flack, considering that idea. Maybe you're right. How many of those things are outside? Flack asked suddenly. Wade moved to a boarded up window and looked out. Christ, the front yard is full of them. He hurried from one window to another, sizing up the situation and not liking it. We're surrounded on all sides. There must be 30 or more zombies out there. So what? Carter said calmly. We can burn our way through them like we did before. Wade Connolly stared skeptically. Flack nudged one of the prisoners with the toe of his boot. Zombie feed, he said quietly. Yeah, these aren't real state troopers. Bull motherfucking shit. But I feel like there's going to be some very unpleasant stuff coming our way pretty soon. Pardon Roman. Upstairs, a single humanoid still lurked silently in the dark recesses of Burt Miller's bedroom. The three young people had stumbled past the half-open door, Anne and Billy helping Karen down the hall to her own room. The humanoid had moved slightly, stirred by the awareness of nearby human flesh. Billy left Anne tending to Karen while he peeked Ah. Billy left Anne tending to Karen while he peeked in on Sue Ellen. To his surprise, Sue Ellen was awake, though she lay very still and quiet in the soft glow of light from a lamp near the side of the bed. She looked up at Billy as he entered the room. She appeared dazed and weak. Coming over to the bed, Billy said, "Sue, are you all right?" Sue Ellen began crying softly, as though she did not have the strength to cry harder. Oh, oh dear. Billy sat on the bed, not knowing what to say or do. "That man," Sue Ellen blurted through her tears. "I heard his voice downstairs. He raped me." The girl buried her face in her hands and sobs jerked through her body. Standing by the door, Anne had heard everything and came over and flung her arms around her younger sister, hugging her while she continued to cry. Billy's eyes turned toward the door and widened suddenly. Flack stood in the doorway. "Okay, so now you know," Flack said, brandishing his revolver. "Everybody downstairs." "You bastard!" Billy yelled and started across the room towards Flack, but Flack grabbed his arm and stopped him. "Billy!" Anne screamed. "He'll kill you." "You learn fast," Flack said. "Everybody downstairs to join the party." "My sister is going to have a baby," Anne said, hoping that somewhere in this man there were some human feelings. "She doesn't have to come down," Flack said. "She can stay here and have it." This struck him as very funny, and he let out one of his giggles. "Please, you don't mean it, Flack," Anne pleaded out of desperation. She couldn't believe the man's cruelty. "He means it," Sue Ellen said bitterly. She shuddered when she looked at the man and turned her tearful face to the wall. "God damn it, get your asses downstairs," Flack said menacingly, pointing his revolver. Karen's moans echoed down the hall. Billy and Anne helped Sue Ellen out of bed, and the three preceded Flack down the stairs, his gun pointed at their backs. Angel looked up, smiling evilly. "What are we going to do with them?" Wade Connolly grinned. "They ought to satisfy more than a few of those things outside." "Zombie feed," Flack said, keeping his gun trained on Anne, Billy, and Sue Ellen. He liked that expression. "Where's the other one?" John Carter demanded suddenly. "She's still having a baby," Flack said with a snicker. "I don't care if she's taking a crap, Angel. Go get her. I want us all together down here." Angel obediently started for the stairs. Suddenly, a clattering noise came from outside the house. John Carter gestured for Wade to take a look. Wade hurried to the window. "Two of them are near the porch," Wade said. "The bastards must be getting hungry again." "Tell 'em it ain't supper time," Flack said. "Yet," he added for emphasis. Wade poked his rifle between two pieces of wood, broke a pane of glass, and fired two shots, each carefully aimed. Outside near the truck, two ghouls went down, each hit between the eyes. "We're going to need fire to fight our way out of here," Wade said, turning up from the window and cocking his lever-action rifle. Upstairs, Angel headed towards the bedroom where Karen lay moaning, walking quickly past the doorway of Bert Miller's darkened bedroom. A pair of hands brutally grabbed Angel, one over her mouth and face, the other around her neck. Choking the woman, the humanoid creature dragged her quickly into the recesses of the dark bedroom. He put an end to her thrashing by slamming her head against the wall, knocking her unconscious. The sounds of the brief struggle were completely drowned by the firing of Wade's rifle downstairs. Good on the zombie. The ghoul knelt over the unconscious girl, its dead lips drooling spittle. With a glint of lust in its eyes, it bit into the soft flesh of her neck and lingered there. Then its rough hands moved down. The ghoul pulled her blouse off her body in one brutal motion. The ghoul bent its head and sunk its teeth into the girl's firm breasts, chewing bits out of one and then the other. He likes tits. As my grandfather would say, you like titties. But damn, dude, what the fuck? Talk about killing the pussy. All the all the while, groans came from deep within its throat, and the ghoul's body moved rhythmically. When the being raised its head, it tore away one of her nipples. More determined than before, it ripped off the rest of her clothing and relished the soft pulpiness of her thighs and groin until it had chewed its full. Yeah, really talk about killing the pussy. In the living room, Wade Connolly had poked his rifle through another opening and was still firing. He missed, and several ghouls backed off, disappearing behind the overhanging branches and hiding in the shadows of surrounding trees. The dead things had begun to associate the belch and roar of gunfire with the destruction or potential destruction of themselves. Or perhaps it was only that the fire spitting from the barrels frightened them, flames being the one thing they seemed to really fear. Wade cocked his rifle to fire again, but Carter yelled, "All right, that's enough." They backed off, Wade said. "I got two and missed the rest. Stop wasting ammo then." Carter said. Then he called upstairs, "Angel, let's get a move on." "There's a clothesline in the kitchen cabinet. Bring it in here, Wade." Hold on. Ooh, that felt good. Wade did as he was told, and he and Flack used the rope to tie up Anne, Sue Ellen, and Billy so they were unable to move and had to lie on the floor with their hands tied behind their backs. Carter drew his revolver and pointed it at them. "Now, which one of you knows the combination to the safe?" Flack viciously grabbed Anne by the ropes binding her ankles and dragged her over to the safe. He stood over her, jamming the barrel of his gun up under her chin. "You don't want me to blow that pretty little chin up through the back of your head. Now, do you?" "There's nothing in that safe," Anne said in a hoarse whisper. "Don't give me that," Flack belched. "Sue Ellen knows the combination," Anne said. "There's nothing in it. Nothing but phonograph records and old junk." Carter had gotten up and stood over Sue Ellen, his revolver pointed at her head. 16, 23, 53. Sue managed. Then, clearing her throat, she continued, 16 clockwise, once around to 23, then the other way to 53. "Try it," Carter said. Wade knelt by the safe and began spinning the dial. The door opened. Flack laughed, a derisive laugh that turned very mean. Wade pulled out a stack of record albums and began throwing them around the room. "Stupid Hicks," Flack said, and stepped over to where Billy lay tied up and helpless and fetched the boy a hard kick in the ribs. Billy screamed and writhed on the floor, tears of pain starting from his eyes. "Keep all of them covered. I'm going upstairs to see what's keeping Angel." Carter trotted up the stairs and ran into the room where Karen lay on her bed, sweating and moaning in pain. She stared at him wordlessly, pupils dilated in fear. Carter looked around quickly, then pivoted and ran down the hallway until he heard sounds coming from another bedroom and stopped in his tracks. Pistol pointed into the room, he advanced until he could peer into the shadows. His hand found a wall switch near the door and he flicked it on, then flicked it off instantly. The ghoul barely flinched at the sudden brightness, engrossed in its task of devouring Angel. In the brief flash of illumination, Carter had a horrifying image burned into his brain. The grotesque remains of the cannibalized girl and the dead white face of her devourer, smeared with blood. Carter backed out of the room, shaken. He thought of shooting the dead thing, but changed his mind when he decided he had a use for it. He could leave it in the house to take care of those who would be left behind. What a piece of shit. Carter hurried down the stairs into the living room. To Flack, he said, "Let's get out of here. Like you said, we have an appointment with Mr. Kingsley." "Where's Angel?" Wade asked. Carter gave Flack a hard, haunted look. "Ask me later. Let's get out of here. Fast. You three, on your feet." He waved his gun at Anne, Billy, and Sue Ellen, but they could not move because their ankles were tied tightly together. "Cut their feet loose," Carter said impatiently, "except for the boys." Flack unsheathed his knife and cut through the ropes around Anne and Sue Ellen's ankles. "What about them?" Flack said, pointing up. "What about them?" Excuse me. Flack said, pointing at the tied up men. "I think we'll leave them here to satisfy our dinner guests," Carter said. "No, on second thought, I got a better idea. Untie one of them." Hold on a second. Okay. Flack used his knife to cut through the gag and ropes of one of the two men lying on the floor. Immediately, Carter fired his revolver at the man, hitting him in the abdomen. The man writhing, screaming, his wound spurting blood through his fingers. Flack let out his insane laugh. The wounded man moaned and went limp, losing consciousness. "He'll die and come back as one of the zombies," Carter said. "When he wakes up, he'll want breakfast. And there it is, all trussed up and waiting for him." Flack bent over the man still tied up and looked him in the eyes. The two pairs of eyes locked together in mutual hatred. "Zombie feed," Flack repeated, tormenting the man by nudging him in the ribs with the toe of his boot. "Let's get moving," Carter said, and waited while Flack lighted two torches made out of old table legs and handed one to him. "Wade, you drive the cop car," Carter said. "The two girls will ride in back. Me and Flack will ride in the truck." Wade marched the girls to the door, holding his gun on them. Flack opened the door, his torch blazing, and as they moved off the porch, he tossed the torch into the pile of dead bodies doused with kerosene, and the heat burst into roaring flames. Surrounding ghouls backed away from the house, awed by the presence of fire. Flack aimed and fired, felling a humanoid which had been lurking in the vicinity of the patrol car. Wade moved Anne and Sue Ellen along quickly, prodding them with his rifle barrel, forcing them into the back seat of the patrol car. Carter plunged his torch into the chest of an attacking ghoul, setting the creature on fire. The dead thing reeled and fell down, hissing, moaning, flailing, and clutching at the flames, which continued to devour its dry, bloodless flesh. Carter and Flack dragged Billy along roughly by the ropes that bound his body, then lifted him by the ropes and heaved him into the back of the truck as though he were a side of beef. Then Flack hopped him back while Carter climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. Crouched in the back of the truck, Flack fired at several ghouls lurking at the edge of the clearing, they having moved back from the blazing fire. Jesus Christ. James Schmidt. Oh, cool. Wade had his car window down and was firing also, a wild and panicked look on his face as he tried to make sure none of the creatures would mob the car before he could get started out of there, following the truck. The fire continued to blaze brightly, rising from the pile of bodies, and in the field stretching away from the farmhouse, more ghouls were visible. Wade counted 15 or 20 of them moving through the cornfield, approaching the edges of the expansive lawn. More of the dead creatures were in the road as the truck lurched out suddenly, followed by the patrol car with Wade driving and the girls getting a bumpy, terrifying ride in back. In the bed of the truck, Billy bounced and slid on his side, his body jouncing, you mean bouncing, into jagged contact with a couple of gasoline powered generators and their cables. Bearing down on the accelerator, Carter gritted his teeth and his eyes flashed as the truck rammed the first school in the road, then another and another. The thuds were loud, the dead things having been smacked hard, staggering in the beam of headlights. But they stood up again, slowly as though stunned, rising one after another after the truck hit them. Wade kept the patrol car following closely behind the truck, his knuckles clenched white on the steering wheel. Anne and Sue Ellen, arms still tied, huddled in back, restraining their screams through though their faces were frozen in horror. From the bed of the truck, fuck. Flack continued to fire his rifle, bouncing and taking aim with difficulty in the glare of careening headlights of the patrol car. The truck squealed and slid around the tight curve, and Flack and Billy were both thrown against the generators. The blu- the butt of Flack's rifle inadvertently slamming into Billy's ribs. The boy screamed helplessly while Flack cursed and seized the side of the truck to pull himself up into a half crouch. Then they hit a straightaway, and there appeared still more ghouls on the road. Having slowed for the curve which the truck had taken so dangerously, the patrol car had fallen about 100 feet behind. The truck slammed into one of the humanoids, knocking it forward and into the air, and running it over with a heavy thump thump as two sets of tires went over the fallen body. From the car, Wade saw the dead thing lying in the road, its head crushed flat, and he ran over it too, because there was no way to get around it. But he had braked, putting even more distance between the car and the truck. In the rearview mirror, Carter saw the car lagging behind and hit his brakes, putting the truck in reverse, and ran the truck backward towards the approaching car. Several more ghouls were bowled over in the process, some of them still rising from having been hit before. His eyes wide with fear, Wade screeched the car to a halt, and now both vehicles were stopped in the road with 9 or 10 ghouls closing in. Carter wound down his window and fired at an approaching humanoid, hitting him between the eyes and blowing out the back of his skull, the force of the blast knocking the dead thing over an embankment at the edge. Sticking his head out the truck window, Carter yelled, "Feed the bastards!" From the back of the car, Anne and Sue Ellen screamed as they saw Flack lower the tailgate, lean against the cab, and shove Billy away with his feet. I knew it. I knew Billy was going to be thrown to the zombies. Billy slid from the truck, the ropes around his body making it impossible for him to grab onto the truck bed to save himself. His foot managed to hook itself around the corner of one of the generators for a split second, and it seemed that he wouldn't go over. Flack saw what happened and gave Billy another kick. The girls saw the generator go over the bed of the truck along with Billy's trussed up body. Hearing the thud in the road, Carter hit the accelerator and lurched out, almost throwing Flack into the road head first. Hanging onto the side of the truck, Flack yelled, "The generator! Hold it! The generator! We lost it!" Flack's voice was lost in the roar of the truck, and Carter kept going, and Wade wasn't about to stop. He ran the car way off the road into the shoulder to get around Billy and the generator as the ghouls started to close in. 5 or 6 humanoids converged upon Billy's limp form as he lay unconscious in the dirt road. At least Billy is unconscious, so at least he can't feel it. Several of these creatures, having been hit or run over by the truck, were grotesquely mangled and deformed, much bloodier than they had been earlier and even more hideous. One had a chest crushed and flattened on one side, splintered ribs jutting through pierced skin and torn clothing. Another had the flesh abraded from its face by rough sliding contact with the dirt and gravel road. Its nose was almost gone, and the white of its cheekbones showed where they were no longer covered by dead skin. Still another had suffered the loss of a leg and had to drag itself along slowly, his body oozing towards the place where Billy lay helpless in the middle of the road. Mercifully, Billy did not feel any pain as the first school to reach him stumbled and lunged, falling upon the boy and sinking dead teeth into the soft flesh of his throat. The blood began to flow. Lured by the smell of blood, the rest of the dead things came to satisfy their hunger. Billy was soon dead and being ripped apart. The truck and the patrol car sped away safely. In the back of the car, Anne and Sue Ellen cried and cried, terrified and helpless in the anguish of grief for which there was no comfort. They did not care if they lived or died, and they both knew they would probably not live. When they reached the highway, both vehicles stopped. Wade took strips of cloth from the trunk of the car and gagged the two sobbing girls. Flack hopped off the bed of the truck, raised the tailgate and secured it, then climbed into the cab next to John Carter. Pieces of fucking dog shit. The Kingsley estate, Carter said, and made a right turn onto the highway. Flack grinned, showing his approval. The truck ground through its gear changes and hit a cruising speed. The patrol car followed. Okay, I'm gonna do one more chapter. In the living room of the Miller farmhouse, two state troopers lay on the floor, one tied and gagged, the other wounded in the upper right side of his abdomen just below the rib cage. Oh, so those were the real state troopers. I should have thought. The wounded one lay very still as blood continued to trickle from the hole in its side, or in his side. Officers Carl Martinelli and Dave Benton had been overpowered and captured by John Carter and his gang of looters after being lured into an ambush by the girl, Angel. She had put on a good act, pretending that her brother had been attacked and badly wounded by several of the humanoid creatures, but she got her tits and pussy eaten off by a zombie. Poetic justice. Fearing that the brother would die and the girl would need assistance in disposing of the body, troopers Benton and Martinelli had driven with Angel in their patrol car to an isolated farmhouse where Carter, Flack, and Wade Connolly took them by surprise and captured them. They were forced to exchange clothes with Connolly and Carter, and they were tied and gagged while two of the outlaws disguised themselves as state troopers. I knew it. The gang had killed the occupants of the farmhouse and robbed whatever was of value. Without taking his eyes off his partner's inert body, Dave Benton was struggling to free himself. His efforts took the form of trying to stretch and loosen the ropes which bound his wrists, in hopes that he could slip his hands through, but the ropes were so tight that his wrists hurt, and trying to free himself in that way seemed impossible. He ceased his struggles abruptly and, forcing himself to be calm and rational, moved his eyes appraisingly about the room in search of something that could be of help. The living room door was shut, but not barred. John Carter had wanted the door closed in hopes of delaying the creatures outside and saving the victims inside for a more ironic fate. Through cracks between the planks of the boarded up windows, Dave Benton could see that the fire still blazed in the front yard. He supposed that because of the fire, the flesh eaters had so far not mounted a concerted attack against the house. Dave knew the attack would come, it was merely a matter of time. Time for the dead things to get hungry enough, for the fire to die down, for the things to lose their fear. Dave did not know that some of the creatures had temporarily satisfied themselves on the flesh of the boy, Billy, who had been tossed from the bed of the truck to appease the ghouls while Carter's gang made good their escape. Pieces of dog shit. Oh, the rapists, too. Dave had to free himself somehow so he could replace the beams and the brackets of the door and tend to his partner's wound before the worst happened. He had hoped that his partner would not die. He had experience with gunshot wounds, and the loss of blood did not seem too great. And he knew if no vital organs were damaged, first aid could accomplish a lot, and Carl could be gotten to a hospital. A shudder went through Dave when he thought of what would happen if he could not get free, and Carl did die and came back as one of the flesh hungry ghouls. Dave did not know of the danger upstairs and what had happened in Bert Miller's bedroom. He knew something had happened to Angel, but he didn't know what. There did not seem to be anything in the living room sharp enough to cut rope. There was a mirror over the fireplace, and Dave tried to think of a way to break it. Maybe he could get to his feet and manage to hit the mirror with something heavy. No, this did not seem workable. The mirror was too high, and Dave's movements were very limited because of the way he was tied. He figured he could crawl to the kitchen and try to get a knife out of a drawer. At that moment, Carl Martinelli moaned and raised his head off the floor. Dave stared at his partner, wishing he could say something to his friend. Carl moaned again, clutched at his wound, and allowed his head to fall back onto the floor. Dave was very relieved that his partner was still alive and had regained consciousness. Carl's eyes were open and he was breathing heavily, obviously in pain. Dave could do nothing but watch. He could not talk because his gag was too tight, but he knew that if Carl did not die yet and if he kept his wits about him, there was hope. After lying still for a few seconds, Carl pulled his hand away from his wound and looked at the hand stained with blood, staring as if it could somehow tell him how bad his wound was. Dave squirmed around and made sounds with his throat, trying to gain Carl's attention and help him reorient himself. Carl got an elbow under himself and sat up painfully, staring with glazed eyes at Dave as he rolled around. Dave jerked his head around a couple times and made still more sounds, indicating the unboarded door. Carl looked, understood, and struggled to his feet. He took a few tentative steps, found that he could move without kneeling over, and slowly went to the door, and after what seemed to be an eternity to Dave, boarded it. Dave watched, assessing his partner's movements and feeling a large measure of relief. Carl turned from the door and felt his wound, unbuttoning his shirt to look. Dave made his deep, throaty sounds again, and Carl realized he had to get his partner untied. The wounded man felt as if he were working in slow motion. Slug still rattling around inside there, Carl said. Hurts like hell. I think it nicked a rib. His voice sounded weak and unsure at first, but got better as he knelt carefully and began to untie Dave and keep on talking. My head hurts. I fell pretty hard, I guess. I think I'll be okay. His talking seemed to reassure him that he really was alive. Carl got Dave's hands untied and waited while Dave unfastened his own gag and untied his ankles. Dave stood up and rubbed his numbed wrists. Sit down, Dave said. Lie down on the couch. We've got to find something to get you bandaged up. Boy, am I glad you're here. Carl did as he was told, with Dave helping him to lie down. Carl moaned, his forehead beaded with sweat. Rotten bastards, he said. Heavier slugs would have finished me for sure. I'll get the sons of bitches if it's the last thing I do. I think he shot you with a 32, Dave said, and his voice trailed off as he rounded the corner and disappeared into the kitchen. He was uneasy about the upper floor, and his idea was to arm himself before going upstairs. He rummaged through a drawer in the kitchen cabinet and found a heavy cleaver and a couple of long knives. He took them out and put them on the kitchen table. Then, under the cabinet, he spotted a toolbox and a burlap sack. The sack was filled with heavy iron spikes. Dave opened the toolbox and took out a large claw hammer, which he felt would have made a handy weapon. Carl propped himself up on his elbow when Dave entered the living room. Dave handed Carl one of the knives so he could not be without protection. Then, holding the cleaver in one hand and the claw hammer in the other. Okay, I'm just about done. Dave started for the upstairs. He ascended the steps slowly and quietly, not sure of what he would encounter. At the top of the stairs, standing in the glare of a naked light bulb, Dave paused. The door to a darkened bedroom was half open. Dave pushed open the door further with his foot, his weapons ready, as light from the hallway spilled into the room. Dave's heart jumped to his throat. He caught a glimpse of Angel's remains as the dead thing which had devoured her turned, its face smeared with blood, and started for the door. Dave held his ground, swung as hard as he could with his claw hammer, hitting the ghoul in the forehead and knocking it back. Dave came at the thing, swinging at it with the hammer and slashing with the cleaver, too. The cleaver opened a gash in the thing's throat, the hammer hit its chest, then its head again, and the creature went down. Clunk! It did not move, but Dave bent over it and smashed its head again and again until it was a bloody pulp. Dave flicked the light on in the room and ran downstairs for the bag of spikes. Once back in the room, he drove a spike into the ghoul's shattered skull. It's kind of pointless, but okay. Then he looked at Angel, wondering if there was enough left of her to rise again. Not daring to take a chance, he bent over her and hammered a spike into her skull. That's a good idea. Then he backed out of the room, turned the light off, and shut the door. In the hallway, he shuddered, leaning against the wall. From downstairs came Carl Martinelli's voice, pained but surprisingly strong. Dave? Dave, what's going on up there? Shaken and breathing heavily, Dave walked to the top of the stairs to reply. It's okay, he yelled. One of those things was up here. I finished it off. He lowered his voice. It's what got Angel. Carl heard. He stared speechlessly at the stairway, sitting up on the couch. The horror of what their fate could have been swept over him. He clenched his knife, finding that his hand was strong enough to hold it and make it useful for defense. He had not lost so much blood that he was helpless. He could defend himself and survive. Upstairs, Dave had heard the steady moaning of the girl, Karen. He entered her bedroom, which was at the end of the hall. Bathed in perspiration, she was lying flat on her back on the drenched sheets. She seemed delirious, but she looked at Dave. He saw the tears running down her cheeks. The pains are coming every few minutes, she said. My baby is going to be born. Help me, please, whoever you are. Please. Her voice had a weak, futile sound. Dave let his breath out slowly, pitying her, despairing of his ability to handle the situation. All he knew about the delivery of babies had been learned in a handful of brief childbirth classes he and his wife had attended in preparation for the birth of their son. The son was now 2 years old. Dave had had a few years to forget the little that he had ever known. I'm a policeman, a real one. Don't worry, I'll help you, he said, trying to sound reassuring. Can you help too? Karen nodded her head and looked at Dave hopefully before he ran down the stairs. In the kitchen, he rummaged in the closet where he found a clean white towels and washcloths and a stack of clean sheets. He also found a bottle of antiseptic solution and a revolver and a box of ammunition. Excitedly, he snatched the gun into his hand, checked to see that it was loaded, found that it was, and tucked it under his belt. He spotted a denim jacket hanging on a hook, tried it on, and found that it fit, kept it on, spilled the ammunition into the jacket pockets. Then he began tearing one of the bed sheets into strips for bandages. This done, he brought the cloth strips and the bottle of antiseptic solution into the living room and looked at Carl Martinelli, who struggled to sit up, and began removing his torn and bloody shirt. "I'm going to get you cleaned up and bandaged," Dave said. "Then you're going to help me deliver a baby." "You're kidding," Carl said, wincing as Dave poured the antiseptic onto his wound. "No, I'm not. The girl's in labor up there, and her baby's going to be born." Outside, the flames rising from the pile of dead bodies were beginning to die down. And with that, I'm going to stop there. As I suspected, those troopers were not real troopers, obviously. And now I've bitched and complained many, many times in zombie media that the human threat always bores the shit out of me. However, well, I mean, thus far, here the human threat is not taking the spotlight away from the zombies, which are obviously still a big, current, and huge problem at the moment. But thus far, Dave and Carl, that's his name. Dave and Carl seem like likable guys, so hopefully they stick around for the rest of the book. That's gonna be it for today. Post your comments down below. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and share this video with your friends. Look forward to the next reading. And as always, I will see you guys in the next video.